I'm speaking with Nicholas Parisi, author of Rod Serling, His Life, Work, and Imagination. Thank you for speaking with me.
Glad to be here, Chris. Thanks for having me.
So let's start. Can you tell me how you got into studying and writing about not just Rod Serling, but science fiction or TV? How do you get into this?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think, like most people, as far as Serling goes, the Twilight Zone was what drew me into his world. Mm-hmm. And I became a Twilight Zone fanatic from the time I first saw the show when I was around 10 years old. And so my interest in Serling began there, and it just kind of blossomed from there. As the years went on, I just became aware of all the other things that he had written and that frankly haven't been given enough attention. Mm-hmm. And I became, interested in all of these things. I mean, he's co-writer of the original Planet of the Apes. He had all these terrific shows during the golden age of television, Night Gallery, of course, and a lot of, shows that no one, would ever have heard of. Mm-hmm. So I became, kind of a collector in terms of information. I just wanted to get information about his entire career. And that's what spawned the book, essentially, was that, he wrote over 250 scripts for television and film, mm-hmm. and so many of them are unknown to the general public, and I really wanted to try to, bring those to light, and also to provide a truly complete record of his career, and I think I accomplished that. I hope I did, anyway.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about the book, then. How do you lay it out? How is it divided? That sort of thing.
Well, it's interesting you ask it that way, because that is one of the key things about the book, I think, is the way that it is structured. I think it's got a very different structure to it. It's part biography. It's certainly not a biography, but there is partial biography to it. But then it's part reference guide to all of these different shows, and it's part critique and literary analysis of the different themes that Serling dealt with, and the way I structured is it's strictly chronological. So it starts right at the beginning with his first shows. Well, it starts with his early life, but then when it gets into the videography, I call it starts with his first show in 1950, mm-hmm. and goes straight through his death in 1975, and it just kind of goes in and out of these series and discusses the themes that he was dealing with in each of these shows. And shifts back into biography a little bit here and there, but it basically just gives you a picture of his entire writing life, mm-hmm. Through the stories themselves, through the shows themselves.
So his, I'm not sure how many radio plays he wrote. I guess you don't address those, or how do you approach that?
Actually I do. And in fact, that was one of the things that had not been covered at all, really, in prior publications, is his radio scripts, and he had one particular radio series that he created, mm-hmm. called It Happens to You. And this was real golden age, radio. It was from 1954. And it was produced in Cincinnati, where he had previously worked and he went to school in Ohio, but he worked in Cincinnati, and he produced it in Cincinnati, but it actually was broadcast nationally on the NBC network in the summer of 1954. Mm-hmm. And in prior publications, I had always seen this series referenced as his proposed series or his potential radio series. They always kind of gave it the impression that it never was produced, but it was. It aired for, I believe, 13 weeks in the summer of 1954. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the scripts that he used on that show were never produced anywhere else. So you have, this is the only example of these particular shows. And two of the shows still exist on tape. So so those are out there. But yeah, so he had that series, and he broke in as a radio writer in 1949. Mm-hmm. His first scripts that he ever sold were to a series called Grand Central Station, mm-hmm. Old-time radio show that he sold a few scripts to. So yeah, he began in radio, and he went back to it for this particular series, and then later on he hosted a series called The 0 Hour, mm-hmm. Which was a syndicated dramatic series. He didn't do any writing for that show, though. He only hosted it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I do get into that as well. Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting that he's a writer. How did he end up getting on screen? Is that something he wanted to do, or is it just kind of circumstance brought him?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that he did want to be on screen. I mean, there's enough there's enough evidence that he was a bit of a ham himself. And, when he was younger, he did some acting. I mean, he acted in, school plays and that kind of thing from the time he was 5 years old. And he acted in his own radio productions when he did actually have something I left out. And when he was going to Antioch College in Ohio, he created the radio series there as well. So he acted in those particular shows. And I think he did always want to be on screen in some respect, but he knew he wasn't, an actor. He knew he wasn't a great actor, and plus he was 5 feet 5 inches tall, and that wasn't exactly leading man material. So, so when it came to the Twilight Zone, he was obviously already introducing the series, narrating it, and before the second season started, and this is actually just to kind of debunk a myth that has been spread about the Twilight Zone. The myth is that CBS originally wanted Orson Welles to narrate and host the Twilight Zone, and that Rod Serling kind of lobbied for the role and got it. Well, that's not exactly true. What happened actually was that Serling was the narrator. They had another narrator originally, but they knew he wasn't really going to be permanent. So Serling got the job pretty quickly at the beginning. But what happened was after the first season was done, and they were getting ready for a second season, the network thought, if we have an on-screen presence here, it might add a little pizzazz to the show. Maybe it get us some attention. Maybe we should contact Orson Welles. And at that point, that's when they decided that they would try to get Orson Welles. But Orson Welles, he would have wanted to be paid, obviously. Yeah. and they were already trying to cut the budget. They certainly weren't going to add budget for a narrator. So Rod again said, hey, if you want somebody to be on screen, I'll be on screen. And so he got it. So that's the way it happened. But I mean, over the years, of course, Serling kind of played up the idea that he kind of fell into the job and he didn't really like it very much. But I think that's him being a little, humble, or I don't know, a little facetious, I guess. He wanted the job and he got it, and he liked it. I mean, he was nervous doing those introductions, but he liked the notoriety that came along with being recognizable.
So reading some of his bio info, I got the impression he liked to talk a lot. So how does, and I'm trying to reconcile, maybe it's not hard to reconcile, if you like to talk a lot, can you translate that to writing a lot too? Is that essentially what happened? He wrote down everything he wanted to say?
Well, yeah, to some extent. Rod he was a very articulate guy, and he was a very thoughtful guy, and he was always a talker, back to when he was a kid, when he was really young. I mean, there's a story in Mark Zickry's book that Robert Serling, his brother, tells about how he was such a nonstop talker, Rod was, that one time when they were going to take a trip in the car from Syracuse to Binghamton or something, and back then that was like a 4-hour drive now, because the cars back then, go 40 miles an hour or something. But he said to his father, he said, let's just not respond to anything Rod says and see how long it takes him to shut up. See if he ever notices that nobody else is talking but him. And he says, I swear to you, he talked nonstop for the entire 4 hours from one stop to the other, just continued to talk. And when we got there, we just died laughing as got out, because we knew that would happen. But so he was always a talker, and he was on the debate team in high school, and so it just kind of they do go together somewhat, writing and talking. He was an articulate guy, as I said, and that lent itself to being an articulate writer, if you can say that, so that's and yeah, he did. He wrote. I don't know any writer who wrote more from the heart than Rod Serling. He so sometimes to his detriment, that he wrote with his heart on his sleeve, and you could see exactly what he was wanted to say in a particular script, but. If you were in the choir, you didn't mind being preached to, and that's where I am. I mean, I'm definitely part of the choir, and I don't mind that form of preaching. Rod Serling just said it like he wanted to say it. He didn't mince words.
Does your book go into where his concern for social issues began? Do you delve back into that at all, or
a little bit? I don't purport to identify, the beginning, like this is where, his awareness began or anything like that. But I do, of course, address the fact that he was always this way. He believed he was just adamantly anti-prejudice. He was just, that was his big bugaboo was the idea of prejudice. And it went back to when he was a kid. You could speculate about him growing up in a Jewish family, and he did experience some anti-Semitism. There are stories about him being held out of a fraternity at one point because he was Jewish, or he was dating non-Jewish girls, and the whole that came about at one point. And so I mean, some of it was due to that, but I think it was just kind of something in him, just something in his nature that lent itself to that, and he tried to address the issue frequently in his writing. And sometimes he was successful, and sometimes the censors got to him and said, "No, you can't say that," But yeah, so he was very socially aware and socially conscious from the time he was a kid. And in fact, I'm going to give you an example. The Binghamton the high school newspaper, and this is when he was in 10th or 11th grade, described him as always being ready for a heated debate on virtually any subject. This is when he was in 10th or 11th grade. So he was always that way.
So, are there any main themes or issues that you'd like to mention that you highlight, or you can keep that for the readers to discover when they buy the book?
Well, no, I mean, I can certainly talk about a few of them. Well, I mean, I can give you one just my kind of point. If there was one point in the book that I really wanted to make, just to sum it up, is really that Rod Serling was more than the Twilight Zone. And I don't mean to shortchange the Twilight Zone at all, because I love the Twilight Zone more than anybody, and I dedicate a huge portion of the book to it. But kind of one of my points of the book, themes of the book, was that he was so much more. He wrote so much more, and he wrote so much more that was good. And I think that gets lost in the shuffle. I think that if you read some of the biographical material on Serling, or you even any of the biographical material that's out there, you kind of get a picture of Serling that I don't think is accurate. And the picture I think you'll very, very easily get, is that Serling was kind of a middling writer who broke through with a show called Patterns on the Kraft Theater in 1955, and that he was overnight a success. And then the next year he hit again with Requiem for a Heavyweight. And then he did the Twilight Zone, and the Twilight Zone was as brilliant and great as it was. And then after that, it just kind of was a steady downhill fall. And I don't think any of that is true. I think that's nonsense. I think that he wrote a lot of other stuff that was great before the Twilight Zone, and he wrote a lot of stuff that was great after the Twilight Zone. So that's one of the things I try to bring out, is some of the shows you may have heard are terrible, or even from Serling himself, because Serling was he was his own worst critic. Harshest critic. He was so hard on himself all the time. So some of the shows you may have heard Rod Serling, criticize the most, terribly, turn out to be really good shows. So I wanted to bring some light to those. And as far as what we're talking about, as far as the social issues, I get into the Emmitt Till case, pretty deeply. That was the case of, if anybody doesn't know, shame on them, but I'll repeat, the case of a 14-year-old African-American kid in Mississippi who was lynched for allegedly whistling at a white woman. And Rod Serling was just terribly affected by this, and he wanted to dramatize it, and he couldn't. He just couldn't break through the censors. And I tell a version of this story, I think, in the book that you'll have never read before, about the censorship, or lack of censorship, that he actually did face with CBS over that particular script called Noon on Doomsday. So that's one of the things I get into. Okay.
So can you tell me about the resources you used to do this research?
Sure. Serling was... he was a prolific writer, not just of scripts, but of correspondence. He kept all his letters, and I swear you would think that he responded to every fan letter he ever got. I mean, he responded in his own, signed, personalized. He responded to everything. And he kept everything. So there are archives around the country. The main archive is in Wisconsin. It's the Wisconsin State Historical Society. They have a collection of 81 boxes of Serling scripts, correspondence, contracts, and miscellaneous things that you are free to go through, with an appointment. So I spent a good deal of time there going through all of that stuff. There's another archive at UCLA that's about, I think it's 40 boxes, something like that. Same thing, of scripts and et cetera. So I went through that. There is another archive at Ithaca College where he taught late in his life. So that has some material that isn't available elsewhere. I went to Antioch College in Ohio, and there was I found some really interesting stuff in the Antioch College archive itself that I had not seen quoted anywhere or referenced anywhere else. So I went there. And then the other thing I did was, and this was the most enjoyable part of the writing and research, was I watched absolutely everything that exists. Something I watched. So I went to the Paley Center in New York City a dozen times, watching every single show that exists at the Paley Center. I went to UCLA, has a couple of shows that don't exist anywhere else. I went there. I collected rare films that no one else really has or haven't been released commercially. So I watched everything. And when you think about that, Serling wrote 92 of the Twilight Zone episodes, and he wrote 38 of the Night Gallery stories. So that's 130 right there. And he wrote over 250 scripts. So you're talking about there's 120 other scripts that are outside of Twilight Zone and Night Gallery. So yeah. And I watched a ton of those shows, and as I said, was pleasantly surprised by very many of them. Wow,
that's pretty neat. Were you able to interview anyone connected to Rod Serling?
Well, thankfully, I became fairly close friends with Anne Serling, his daughter, and she was tremendous in helping me in terms of really just encouraging me. When I first met her, I brought her essentially the outline of the book, and I had already started writing it and everything, but I had the outline, and I brought it to her, and of course, not knowing how she would react, and she called me the next day and said, this is wonderful. Please finish it. Please do it. It'll be great. And she ended up agreeing to write the foreword for the book. And I'm so grateful for her, because just that enthusiasm really was instrumental in making me complete the book. So other than her, I really didn't do too many first-hand interviews, a couple, but not too many, because I really was dealing with the shows themselves, the scripts themselves, and the productions themselves, and let's face it, 98% of the people who are involved are dead now, so there wasn't too many that I really could reach, even if I wanted to. So I really focused on just the material itself, and did it that way. Yeah. Was there any particular document, say script or something that just holding really was cool or special? Yeah, a couple actually, but I'll give you the main one was and this is again something that I'm really proud of that I was able to reveal in the book, is that I was able to track down the true first draft of that Noon on Doomsday script that we mentioned, the Emmitt Till case. This is a script that nobody had ever, I discovered it. There have been a couple of really, really in-depth studies of the Noon on Doomsday evolution, from where Serling started to where the network messed with it and where it ended up. And all of those studies do not mention the actual first draft. They didn't have it. They didn't have access to it. Well, I was able to find it. And yeah, you say about holding it, that was one of those things, because I honestly wasn't sure it was going to be what I thought it was until I actually had it in my hands. I said, I can't believe this. I can't believe this is actually the first draft. So that was one. And the other thing is at Wisconsin, when Serling donated all his materials to Wisconsin, that's how they got there. He donated all of this stuff. He wrote little notes, basically to himself or to posterity, really, on the covers of his scripts. So he would write little things about his own assessment of the script itself, or just a funny thing, or whatever it may be. So, he wrote things like, there was a show called The New People that he wrote, and it was edited pretty heavily before it aired. And on the cover of the script, he wrote, "This was a nice piece of work, but ABC cut 20 minutes out of it, and it bled to death." Yeah. Things like that. He wrote, there was a show he wrote he wrote a version of Jekyll and Hyde, the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that ended up being rewritten and credited to somebody else. And he actually wrote on the cover of that, rewritten by yet another British writer. and that particular script, he was angry about getting rewritten, and he would write little snide remarks all over the place about being rewritten. He was not real happy about that one. So some of the stuff you saw, and you just kind of really got this feeling of almost like he was sitting there next to you, telling you this stuff. It was really was a pretty cool experience.
Yeah. What was the most surprising thing you found in your research?
Well, I will tell you, I think that Noon on Doomsday script was a big surprise. I don't want to ruin the reveal in the book, but that was a big surprise. And beyond that, I think the biggest surprises that I had really were, like I was saying, the shows that turned out to be really good that he and other people had always, degraded or degraded. For example, things that maybe I like more than other people, but a show or a movie like The Man, let's say. The Man was a movie starring James Earl Jones that he wrote. It was about the first African-American president, and it was based on a novel by, oh my God, I can't believe I'm going to forget his name now. I'm going to forget his name. But it was based on a novel. And you thought, it didn't do well at the box office, that's for sure. And you would, from reading about it, you think it was terrible. And I watched it. I really liked it a lot. And there were certain shows that got some really good reviews that you would think were universally panned. For example, Forbidden Area, the first episode of Playhouse 90. If you read any of the biographical material, you would think that Forbidden Area got absolutely trashed and hammered by the critics, and then the next week was Requiem for a Heavyweight, which set the world on fire, and it was great, and that was it. But it turns out Forbidden Area got at least a couple, and I'm not talking about Podunk, Iowa. I'm talking about major newspapers, great reviews, rave reviews from a couple of papers. And I happen to like that show a lot. So things like that surprised me when I would find a show that got really good reviews that I had been led to believe were terrible. So that was a very pleasant surprise to find things like that.
Was there an issue that was very difficult to research that maybe you still haven't gotten your hands around or just took a lot of time to come to a conclusion?
Well, yeah, that is a good question, and I did my best with this, but one of the kind of lost treasures in the Serling catalog is this show that he wrote in Cincinnati called The Storm. He wrote, this is essentially right after college, he went to work for a radio station, WLW, and WLW also was in television, and they didn't do drama really. They did, Midwestern hayride and really yokel kind of stuff. And that was not Serling. Serling wanted to write real drama, and there was a show across town at WKRC, not P, but KRC, called The Storm. It had just started, and it was an original dramatic series produced in Cincinnati using all Cincinnati talent. And Serling saw that and said, "Wow, okay, I can get my stuff on this show." And he essentially took the show over. He ended up writing every episode of the show for a certain period, for the entire second season and most of the first season. And unfortunately, these were live productions that were not recorded on film, so they're almost all lost. But it kind of depends on how you count. There are like 2 or 3 episodes that do exist of it. So I was able to watch one out of those 2 or 3, and it'd be too long a story to tell you why I'm hedging on the number. But the scripts themselves is the real lost part, because almost very few of the scripts, even the scripts themselves, exist in those Serling archives that I mentioned. So there were a lot of them that I could not even read. And so that was frustrating to not be able to get my hands on those particular scripts. But I should say, one show that he did on The Storm, again, talking about surprises, this is another big surprise I had, was one particular show he did on The Storm that I was able to talk about in the book for the first time. Again, nobody's ever brought this particular show up, but it is a show that Rod Serling did addressing the issue of prejudice on Cincinnati television in 1952. And yeah, and from what I can gather, I think this is the first time anybody had addressed prejudice on television anywhere. Because it certainly was not going to be done on network television. His agent at the time told him, "Rod, nobody's going to touch this. You don't even bother sending it." So they're not going to touch this. But it was done in Cincinnati, and it's a very interesting story about. It's not a black and white issue. It's an Asian American issue. It's a Chinese American issue. So it's a very interesting story. And again, this is if you look at, I found this particular show in an old version of It's called TV Dial Magazine. It's like a version of TV Guide at the time. And if you see this particular show, the description of it, you'll see all around it. It's like, my little Margie has a toothache, and so and so has to go, goes to the prom or something, and then it's, on the Storm, it's a Chinese American company are run out of town because of the color of their skin. It's like, whoa, holy moly! It was like it might as well be radioactive on the page. It's like jumps out at you like, holy, And that was Rod Serling. He was an innovator and a trailblazer on that issue particularly, but in several other issues as well.
It's interesting because it sounds like the golden age of television. I guess it really hit in 54, 55. So it sounds like he was one of a small group of people trying to really push the envelope for something serious.
Absolutely, yeah, that's absolutely it. And he tried, and after Patterns, was his big hit, and he had a little more prestige. That's when he really took it into a higher gear, and he figured, listen, I got a voice now. I can say this. I'm going to try my best to do this. And he ran up against a brick wall most of the time, but he at least gave it a shot.
Do you know if, I forget when McCarthy was doing, specifically when he was going after people in Hollywood, did that affect Serling at all, or?
It didn't affect him professionally, because it did actually begin right around 1950 and 51, 52,
okay.
Very early in his career, but it certainly affected him personally. He wrote a letter, Serling did, to the Cincinnati Enquirer about McCarthy, because Cincinnati, if you don't know, Cincinnati is a somewhat conservative city. Usually you find cities tend to be more liberal, and obviously the outskirts tend to be more conservative. But Cincinnati's a pretty conservative town, and I, from what I gathered, the Cincinnati Enquirer was very defensive of McCarthy, and Serling wrote them a letter, ripping McCarthy up, and that was in 1952 or 3, I think. So, he wasn't exactly risking very much because he didn't have much of a career at that point. But he had enough. But he had enough to say, listen, this is how I feel, and I'm not going to be afraid to write to you about it. So yeah, he was very disturbed by the McCarthy tactics they took. Yeah.
Was there anything you discovered that emotionally moved you that maybe you haven't mentioned yet? You've mentioned a bunch of things, but anything else out there?
Well, I mean, there are a bunch of things that come to mind. Even not necessarily that I discovered in this research, but there was a very moving letter that Serling wrote to the Los Angeles Times after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and you can actually probably find that online somehow if you Google it, you might find it. And it was just a beautiful letter talking about this tragedy that had happened. That's one thing that when I read it, it certainly gets to me. There is another piece that Serling wrote when he was in college. One of the very first things that he wrote when he returned from war, and we haven't actually mentioned that, he served in World War II. Right out of high school, he went and volunteered for the Army, and he served in the paratroopers, and he saw some pretty heavy combat in the Philippines. And when he came back, one of the first things that he wrote was a piece called First Squad, First Platoon. It was a 38-page story that he kind of wasn't sure what he was doing with it yet. He wasn't sure if it was going to be a long short story or maybe the start of a novel or whatever it may be. But it's essentially a 5-chapter story that each chapter memorializes a member of the 11th Airborne who died in service. And so it's hard to read that without feeling a whole lot. It's in the book I say it's as raw as an open wound, because it really is. That's where he was writing from that open wound. So that is a particularly powerful piece, even though it's very, it's amateurish to some, to say it's, and I don't say that as a derogatory term. That's what he was. He was an amateur at the time. But even so, the power of it, the emotion of it comes through so clearly. Whenever Serling was writing about the war, about battle, those just can't help but get to you, because he really he saw some terrible things, and he wrote about them. He wrote from the emotion of it.
So the stuff that you analyze in the book, I guess his wartime experiences come up during some of your analysis, I guess. Or?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I do go strictly chronologically. So So I get to his war years, I cover, some of his service, and then the war-related shows that he wrote when he came back. And then throughout his career, it comes up again and again and again. He wrote, a story called The Strike for a show called Studio One, which is very good, set in the Korean War, actually. He wrote a couple of shows for Twilight Zone that were set in wartime. One was specifically set in Leyte, in the Philippine Islands, where he served. It's called The Purple Testament. That one, and in that one, he actually names some of his war buddies who died in Leyte. So it comes up again and again, and it's one of those things that Carol Serling, his wife, his widow, said that the war was always with him. It never left, and for all of those guys, that's the way it was. Really, for any combat veteran, it never leaves. It's just that's just the way it is.
Yeah. So, what do you hope the book will do?
A couple of things. I do hope that it does reveal to some people that Rod Serling was more than Twilight Zone, as I mentioned, and I got to again emphasize that I love the Twilight Zone, love it to death. It's my favorite show of all time, and I would never say anything bad about it. But at the same time, the fact that nobody knows about some of these other shows does bothers me, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. So I hope people do become exposed to those shows and realize that he was more than that particular series. And the second thing, I hope that it spurs somebody, gets to the right ears somewhere, who might have some of these shows that we think no longer exist, that haven't been released commercially or whatever, and spurs them to release some of this stuff. Particularly, I'll give you like Playhouse 90, classic television series. Serling wrote 10 episodes of it. Requiem for Heavyweight has been released commercially. The Comedian has been released commercially, but but everything else has been released on the secondhand, kind of bootleg market. And I would love to see a nice full-class production of Playhouse 90. Rod Serling's Playhouse 90, and nice transfers and audio and everything. That would be really nice if this kind of perks up somebody's ears to that kind of thing. That would be great. I hope that some of that happens, and really this book is a tribute to Rod Serling. So I hope people just read it and get an appreciation for his career and for his talent.
Do you see that his reputation or people's interest in Rod Serling? Have you seen? How has it been over the years? Does it need a little bit of a boost again? Because I like his stuff a lot too. I love Twilight Zone too. So I'm just curious about that.
I think it's going through a bit of a renaissance now. Nice for me. I really do. I think Jordan Peele is doing this reboot of the Twilight Zone. So that is certainly going to add some attention to the Serling legacy, so to speak. That's coming up fairly soon. And we just did I'm a member of the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation. We're a charity that works to preserve Serling's legacy and promote Serling's legacy, and we just did an event in July called Serling Fest. That was a blast, very well attended, and we showed a lot of things. We had a lot of different speakers and everything. So that that's going on. We've had there's the Rod Serling Award for promoting social justice that they give out in Ithaca College, actually in Los Angeles every year. That's something that's going on, and I think that Serling, I think that what it is. There are so many people in Hollywood right now who owe their creative life to Serling, so to speak. I mean, they acknowledge it. People like J.J. Abrams, people like Matt Weiner, who worshipped Rod Serling. Guillermo del Toro, loved Night Gallery, one of his favorite shows. Worshipped it, just won an Academy Award. So these people, they appreciate Serling, and I think they, are kind of bringing in an awareness to him through their own work.
Mm-hmm. Can you speak to any difficulties you had in finishing the book or getting it published, and how you overcame those? Well,
finishing the book, I didn't have too much trouble, other than the length and the editing. This book was the first draft of this book, and I knew this was obviously a first draft and was never going to be published this way. But the first draft was about 260,000 words and about 1,200 manuscript pages. So I knew that no publisher was going to publish that, so I had to edit the heck out of this thing. So I ended up getting it down to the published version is going to be about 550 pages, I think.
Nice.
But as far as getting it published, I also did know that it was a bit of a niche, subject, and if it wasn't completely Twilight Zone, that it wasn't really going to appeal to the mass market commercial publisher. So I did get, of course, I got rejected by plenty of those, which was fine. And it's being published by the University Press of Mississippi, and I'm so glad that I went with them and that they went with me, because they've done an incredible job of everything, of the cover art, the layout, the pictures, the everything. It's going to be a really beautiful book. And they gave me a really great editor, and she was just terrific right from the get go. Emily. Oh, now I'm going to forget my terrific editor's name, Emily. But anyway, I'm a little brain freeze here. So she helped me get it down to where it needed to be as well. So I'm very, very happy with where the book ended up. And one of the nice things is that the reason I didn't have too much trouble finishing the book was that, believe it or not, the one nice thing was I had a very clear picture of how this book would be structured from the time I started. I could see exactly where those videographies would come in, and where an essay would come in here, and a biographical piece would come in here, and it just really went according to plan, and the final product is very, very close to the way I envisioned it to begin with. So I'm very happy about that, and getting in. So it's coming out October 16th, and through University Press of Mississippi, and I can't wait. I can't wait for people to be able to read it.
So does the press have sort of a series that this fits into, or what's the connection with Mississippi? If
they've done a lot of television books, a lot of books about television history and film history, and really all sorts of pop culture history. So it fits into that realm. There aren't any other Twilight Zone books or anything like that, but it definitely fits into their general theme of pop culture history. And the only other connection is that Emmitt Till story, of course, happened in Mississippi, and that seemed like it was almost kind of like a nice little omen there that Mississippi came asking for came along for the book. So because there's that connection too. But again, they really got the book from the get go. The editor there, the publisher there, they really got what the book was, and they didn't ask me to cut it that dramatically or change it that dramatically, which is, again, one of the things that I knew going in was that certain publishers were going to ask me to do something particular, and gets into kind of inside baseball to tell you, but I knew there was something particular they were going to ask me to do that I couldn't do, and Mississippi never asked me to do it, so I said, okay, great, so I went with them.
Nice. So do you have a future writing project in mind, or? I have a couple of things I'm working on right now, actually, and I can tell you they are Serling related and Twilight Zone related. That's probably about all I can tell you. But that's that I have going on, and hard to work on those. Absolutely. So where can people find you online? Do you have social media or website or anything?
Absolutely. I set up a page for the book specifically on Facebook, so it's not my page; it's the book's page. You can find it at facebook.com, and it's /Rod Serling Dimensions. Okay. Or it might be /. I think it's / actually / Rod Serling Dimensions.
Okay.
You can find me there, and that is just a reference to the working title for the book was Dimensions of Imagination. I asked, that was another thing. I kind of knew that someone was going to ask me to change that, and they did, so I was okay with that. That was fine. So that's the Facebook page, and then if you just go to University Press of Mississippi, I believe it's upress.ms. upress.ms.com, I think, something like that. But if you go to their website, you'll find the listing for the book there. And it is already available. It's up on Amazon, available for pre-order now. So you can find it at any of those places. Okay.
That's all I have. Any final thoughts?
No, just one more thing about that Facebook page, just so people know. It's not like a constant advertisement for the book. It's actually a page dedicated to Rod Serling. So you'll find obscure news items there. I post news clippings from 1946 or even earlier sometimes about Rod Serling. I post quotes from Rod Serling and all sorts of things. So it's not like it's you go there and it's just all about the book. In fact, I've hardly posted anything about the book lately. I'm going to have to pick that up, I think, now.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, thank you for speaking with me.
I appreciate it, Chris. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you for listening. One of the best ways in which you can provide feedback for this podcast is to rate me on iTunes. Please give me a good rating if you like this, or feel free to give me a bad rating if you didn't, and I'll use that feedback to hopefully make this a better podcast. You can also follow me on Instagram under Chris Alvarez Sci-Fi, on Facebook under Chris Alvarez WLC, on YouTube under Chris Alvarez WLC, and on Twitter under Chris Alvarez WLC. You can also get more information on my website, chrisalvarez.com. Please remember my name Chris does not have an H, so it's ChrisAlvarez.com. Thanks for listening, and keep imagining the future.